This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our show is Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Dr. David Frawley, also known as Vamadeva. He is a Vedic teacher and translator, trained in the fields of yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, and Vedic astrology. In 2015, he was the first Westerner to receive the prestigious Padma Bhushan Award from the President of India for service to the nation of a higher order. He was recently granted a special National Eminence Award by the South Indian Education Society. Thank you so very much, Vamadeva, for taking the time to come on our podcast today.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you. Phil is an old friend, and we're very happy to share in this work with both of you.
Thanks, Vamadeva. You have one of the most remarkable resumes of anybody I know. You are a recognized expert in Vedic literature. You've translated Vedic literature. You're a recognized teacher of Ayurveda and Jyotish, or Vedic astrology. And very unusually, you're well recognized and highly regarded in India as well as the West. And you've done all this without the usual Western academic credentials. So can you give us a brief overview of what got you into this work and how this great passion was first ignited?
Yes. Well, first of all, nobody has this type of background in coming out of academia itself, because academia doesn't teach those things.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I started out like you in the late 60s in that generation. And of course, we had a number of Eastern teachings, whether it was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi or Paramahansa Yogananda. And Yogananda's teaching, I think, was the first thing that really impacted me. But in studying those teachings, I was also drawn to the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and also Ramana Maharshi. And I was drawn as kind of a more intellectual, philosophically minded person to study the older traditions. And I gradually began to do that, starting on my own in Denver, Colorado, and then gradually picking up over time resources and connections, and eventually traveling to India. Two events affected me. Apart from, well, first of all, the thing that affected me was just my contact with the teachings by way of meditation and study. And then I was able to come into contact with Anandamaha actually through letters, first in the mid-'70s before I could go to India. And then I did some private research of my own on the Vedas starting about that time. And in 1979, I met M.P. Pandit of the Sri Aurobindo ashram, also in the United States, and showed him my work. He said he would publish the work in India. I said I wasn't an academic. He says, because you were not an academic, you were able to see things that they don't. And he began regular publication of my work in India in 1979. That has continued since. And I've since gone to India more than 40 times. I've met most of the great teachers, most of the great organizations there, as well as worked with many of them in the United States. So that is kind of, in a nutshell, a quick overview of my background. But it's the teachings themselves that drew me in, and some of the great modern teachers as well.
Vamadeva, in 1979, when you started your research, what was your focus, and how has it evolved in the last 30, 40 years? What are the different areas of interest that you initially had, and has it continued pretty much the same, or have you branched out into many other areas of interest?
Yes, it's continued to develop. I began with an interest in yoga, which then took me into Vedanta, which I studied in some depth. That took me into the Vedas through Sri Aurobindo's work, and my initial work was translating and studying Rig Veda, and all of my work has that kind of Vedic foundation. But over time, I connected also to Ayurveda and to Jyotish, and to the greater system of the Sanatana Dharma, so it's been a continual unfoldment through those teachings from the Vedic roots to the different branches of Vedic knowledge, or what today we also call the Vedic sciences.
Vamadeva, you've alluded a couple of times to your difference between your work and your research and what is typically done in academia. Maybe you could illuminate some of that for our listeners. There's been a lot of criticism of the way the dharmic traditions are treated in academia. What is your assessment of that as an insider on one hand and an outsider on the other?
Yes. Well, first of all, I approach this as a sadhak, as part of a spiritual quest, as a part of a meditation and spiritual practice, not as an academic. And I studied what I would say we would call inside the tradition, with traditional yogis and people who are also practitioners of these subjects and also following various sadhanas. So naturally, an inside the tradition view and a practitioner-based view of these yogic and Vedic teachings is going to be very different than an academic trained in a very different Western mindset, often sometimes even a colonial or Marxist mindset, has in looking at the teachings. So we have a different perspective and a certain critique, and I think there is a validity to inside the tradition views as well. Outside the tradition views may also show some things, but for those who want to practice the teachings, the inside tradition views, I think, are more relevant.
Vamadeva, one of the areas of expertise that you have, one of the areas you've studied extensively is Vedic astrology, also known as, my understanding, Jyotish. I've actually had my Jyotish chart done probably a dozen times, and I know very little about it, and I found it to be, for the most part, helpful. Talk to us a little bit about Jyotish or Vedic astrology, how it's different than Western astrology, and I guess what's most confusing to me in any type of astrology is the physics of it, how it actually works. This is a subject matter we could do several shows on, but just the question might be a little too broad, but in a nutshell, how somebody might utilize this in their life and where it comes from.
Yes, I did a whole feature article for Hinduism Today for its October, November, December issue covering all of that, about 16 pages. But to put it briefly, Jyotish is the eye of the Vedas. It is the science of time, the science of karma, and also relates to the movement of the cosmic prana. It's based upon the idea that everything in the universe is interconnected and that the celestial bodies in heaven are also connected to events on earth. The more common mystical microcosmic, macrocosmic correspondences. So through this science of karma, Jyotish helps us understand the karmic influences in our lives, our karmic potentials, the energy pattern of the subtle body, what I also call the DNA of the soul, as opposed to simply the DNA of the physical body, the soul tendencies or some scars that we come into. So Jyotish has a good potential for life guidance on all levels. There's also many levels you can go beyond the basic birth chart. You can work with an astrologer in some depth and over a long period of time and discover much more. But it has these many depths and dimensions covering all aspects of our life, whether it's finances, relationship, career, physical or psychological health, and also creativity and spirituality. So it's a very important discipline to bring into our lives. It is not fatalistic or deterministic or prediction-oriented. Simply, it is looking at the influence and energies we have and how to work with them, like the doshas of Ayurveda shows us how to develop a lifestyle to keep our doshas in balance.
And for people who are curious, how does it differ from Western astrology?
Yes, it differs from Western astrology in several ways. First of all, the commonality is that both systems use planets, signs, and houses. The main technical difference is Vedic astrology calculates the zodiac differently using the fixed stars, or what is called the sidereal zodiac. As many people know, particularly this idea of moving into the age of Aquarius, the vernal equinox has been moving from the point of 0 Aries back through Pisces. So in Vedic astrology, if someone's born on March 21st, we don't regard them as 0 Aries. We put them at around 6 degrees Pisces, which is for the sun, which is the actual place among the fixed stars. And all the other planetary positions and house positions and sign positions are taken back that way, about 24 degrees. But besides that difference, Vedic astrology is much more complicated. It has special planetary yogas showing how planets connect. It has whole systems of planetary periods for timing matters. It has 27 nakshatras or lunar constellations. It has 16 divisional charts and many other influences that makes it much more complex and specific, and having more specific combinations for showing different things in the chart.
Mm-hmm. Vamadeva, you have a tremendous body of knowledge in many areas of Vedic teaching. Do you think that you came into this world, based on the theory of reincarnation, with having done a lot of work in this area? Is it possible that one just accumulates all this and has the propensity to go in this direction without anything in their DNA, anything that they came into this world with already? What is your feeling about that?
Well, first of all, I did obviously have certain karmic background. A lot of the Vedic teachings I could make sense of almost immediately upon looking at them. Some of my friends in India called it the Frawley phenomenon, and connected it back to past life influences. And I'm aware of those things. I'm aware of past life influences. I'm conscious of them, and I know how they operate. And often, to keep teachings alive, teachers also have to come back in some way, or at least maintain that. And in the teachings, we know that your buddhi, or your higher knowledge awareness, comes back with you in every single life. So there are a number of people born in the West today who have some of these past life connections in the East, and even vice versa. And we don't know our background. Someone could think, oh, I don't have any background in these things, and so how can I know? But at a deeper level of soul awareness, almost any person may. And at a deeper level of soul awareness, the entire universe and the cosmic mind dwells within each one of us. So we should be open to a greater spiritual potential within each one of us, and not worry so much about past life karma, but be more concerned about looking more deeply inside of ourselves and having a faith and connection with our deeper spiritual nature that is one with the divine reality that is all pervasive.
Very good. Vamadeva, the people listening to the show and just exploring their spirituality in general hear terms like Vedic, yoga, Hinduism, Dharma, Vedanta. The intersection and interaction of these terms can often be confusing for people, especially the word Hinduism. Can you first of all sort of ferret out some of that for listeners? And do you think of yourself as Hindu? If somebody says, "Are you Hindu?" what do you say?
Yes. Yes. We have to understand that there are different languages for different subjects. You know, modern physics has a certain language, modern medicine has a certain language, spirituality in the Eastern sense has a certain language, and the meditation traditions in the Eastern world have been more continuous, more state and religion supported, so they've been able to develop, I think, better than those in the West, and develop and maintain and preserve a more specific language in terms like Dharma or Karma or Shakti or Samadhi or chakras. All these different things reflect that. And some of these terms can be confusing for us initially, but in the long term we recognize that they are much more specific towards the inner reality that we experience through meditation than kind of the very general terminology we have in the West, particularly in Western philosophy, which is really not so concerned with the exploration of higher states of consciousness, which we do have in the East. And then we've had the problem of these Eastern spiritual terms being given Western common translations. And this is a problem, for example, Atman and self, or Dharma and religion, or yoga becoming asana, or tantra becoming sex, or moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, being identified with salvation. So sometimes the translations also breed confusion and cause mistranslations to arise. Now, the term Hinduism is a modern term for a tradition that has always been called Sanatana Dharma, which means the eternal Dharma or the eternal universal way of truth. And in India, spiritual and teachings were called dharmas. And dharma doesn't mean faith as religion. It means a way of spiritual practice, generally through meditation. So there are theistic approaches to dharma. There are non-theistic approaches to dharma. There is the Buddhist approach to dharma, for example, which is, of course, not theistic. And there's an emphasis on knowledge more so than faith. So Hinduism as Sanatana Dharma is rooted in Veda, which means basically knowledge or science, and with various practices of yoga and meditation that place our own direct experience of truth above any particular outer ideology, faith, or worldview that we hold to. So definitely in that sense, following these things, I do refer to myself as a Hindu. And I've also tried to help remove some of the misconception about what Hinduism is and its greater meaning as Sanatana Dharma. And in that context, I've done a lot of work with the American magazine Hinduism Today, as well as with various Hindu organizations in India, reclaiming this greater dharmic understanding behind the Hindu tradition.
Vamadeva, you mentioned before, and I'm curious, I wanted to ask you about one of the saints you encountered, I believe, when you first went to India, Anandamaha, that many of our listeners have heard of, but many maybe have not heard about her. I've heard many stories of her. Could you just say a few words about her and her influence on you?
Well, first of all, I contacted her by correspondence, and by the time I reached India, she had actually passed away. Mm-hmm. But Anandamaha was the most famous or highly regarded woman saint of modern India. She was often seen as the mother of all the great Indian teachers, like Ramana Maharshi was seen as the great father. She was a Bengali saint and yogini. She has wonderful dialogues. She had many great disciples. She was very close to Swami Shivananda of Rishikesh. And even, I think, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi went to visit her. She was a woman teacher of the highest order that can compare with any of the great men teachers of all time, and her works need more study and examination today.
Yes, and I will add that one of my great regrets is never getting to India in time to meet her in person, but I sat and meditated at her ashram in Hardwar, and it was a very powerful experience. And just her photograph, which you'll see on a lot of American practitioners' altars and desktops, is a very powerful thing.
Yes, and she encouraged me in various ways and gave me special teachings and definitely instilled my confidence to study some of these deeper Vedic teachings that, as an American, young American kind of working on his own, would otherwise not have.
Very good. One of the issues that has come up in recent time with this tremendous interest that's grown over the course of our lifetimes in Vedic teachings in the West and yoga is this issue of what some people call cultural appropriation. There was even an incident recently where a university did not allow yoga classes because the Western culture was appropriating it from India. The way I look at it, there's a very difficult and fine line between inappropriate appropriation, so to speak, and adaptation of these teachings to our Western way of life. How do you see that, and what problems do you see arising from this cross-section of East and West?
Yes, there's actually a bigger issue. What's happened is while the Vedic teachings have been spreading to the West, including yoga, in India, Vedic teachings, including yoga, have been under siege often by Western-educated Indians, and there's a large Marxist contingency in the Indian academic section that is, with its atheistic background, has been very negative about that. So many of these groups that are expanding in the West actually find themselves under siege or criticized in the Indian context from what they see as more Western materialistic or even political and sometimes even religious missionary forces. So there's a very different dynamic in India where these traditions, not only the Tibetan but also the Hindu and many of the others, are struggling to survive. Now, in the Western context, we do not always see that, and we want to use these things for our own personal benefit. And of course, there are traditions here that show us how to do that in a legitimate way, starting with Ramakrishna Vedanta and Yogananda and all of that. But then we have our usual Western business, commercial, and advertising needs, and the change of the times with the social media. So there is a tendency to expropriate many things and to exaggerate certain qualities, including to physicalize and sensationalize yoga. And we can certainly understand certain people who in the East or even in the West who see yoga as a sacred tradition or as a way of meditation can be, if not offended by these, at least disturbed by these, and seek a greater clarity as to these terms mean. We even had Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance and things like that, which is far afield from Zen. So it's not just yoga, but it is a degree of distortion that needs to be addressed. And on top of that, we now have a significant number of people of Indian origin who have immigrated to the United States the past 20 years and have built wonderful temples here, and their children growing up here seeing how their sacred symbols may be debased or abused in a way that would not be done with, say, Christian, Islamic, or Jewish symbols. So naturally there is a reaction. It is a legitimate cause, and it should be addressed. There can be various extreme opinions on various sides that come up, but it is a legitimate issue that we need to look at over the course of time. What are the authentic traditions and what are the deeper teachings versus what are kind of some of the modern marketing ways of developing them. That being said, I think the modern expansion is good, but as things expand, there are some dangers, and we also have to recognize that behind the modern popular expansion, there are deeper spiritual, meditational, knowledge-based traditions and sacred traditions going back thousands of years that we should honor and not just mindlessly commercialize.
Vamadeva, is there one teacher who you consider your teacher, your guru? And on a day-to-day basis, how much time do you give to spiritual practice, and what type of spiritual practice do you engage in, if I could ask?
Yes. Well, first of all, I've been honored to meet with a lot of the great teachers of modern India. I've also had great teachers in different fields, Dr. Balavashka in Ayurveda and Dr. B.V. Raman in Jyotish, but my main guru over the last 20 years has been Sadhguru Shivananda Murti of Andhra Pradesh. He's not so well known in the West. He just passed away in June. He was honored by the Prime Minister of India, by the Shankaracharyas of Kanchipuram, and also Sringeri, and very highly honored. He was the head of one of the major Shaivic orders in India, a great yogi and Vedantin. So that is first part of your question. And the second part, I'm totally engaged in these teachings and have been all along the last, since almost the late 60s, whether it's studying, writing, practicing. And I have a regular sadhana where I am doing meditation, pranayama, and mantra teachings. And I've also learned a certain yogic art of meditation. So instead of going to sleep at night, we use that time to move into deeper meditative states, and also working with the energy around the Brahma Muhurta time in the morning, so that our sadhana is not something we do part of the day. It pervades the state of sleep. It's also there in the waking state with not only specific meditation practices, but learning from Guruji how to hold an inner awareness as part of one's daily activity and is even part of the foundation of karma yoga, and understanding how the teachings pervade the whole of life and nature. Nature has also been a very great teacher, and working with the forces of the cosmic mind through the presence of Mother Earth and Mother Nature.
Vamadeva, the kind of things you just alluded to for your own sadhana, most intriguingly, the sleep practice. Are these practices that you also teach others, or are they just private and you teach others different things?
Well, we have a lot of things that we teach others through different books and courses, but the deeper teachings are taught at a more private level to smaller groups. But I am actually, at least on this one I call the Yoga of the Four States, I will prepare another book relative to those specific practices. We do have books relating to all the other yoga practices, and most recently Shiva, the Lord of Yoga, which discusses a number of these deeper practices. So we do share them, but there's certain deeper teachings that are for individuals, and there are also certain teachings that we're exploring, and we only reveal certain things once we've practiced them for a certain period of time.
And just for clarification, you say we, maybe you want to mention Yogini Shambhavi and the American Institute of Vedic Studies, which is what I assume you mean by we.
Yes, we is, first of all, Yogini Shambhavi Devi, who is my wife, but also a great yoga teacher. She holds a lot of the Shakti of the Himalayan yoga tradition. She also has her own books and mantras, and is highly respected in India as a teacher in her own right, as one of the great women teachers coming out of India today. We also have some other trained teachers and courses and groups that we work with. I have a strong connection with lots of organizations and like to share teachings. Recently I did some major programs with Chinmaya Mission in India, also with the one of the Kanchi Shankaracharya Mutt groups with Swami Dayananda and others. So we also regard Swami Veda Bharati, and so we share teachings and do work with a number of these groups and try to let people understand it's not us or us individually. We do have our own American Institute of Vedic Studies, but we have very broad-based connections with gurus and teachers in India, but also with other yoga, Veda, Ayurvedic organizations throughout the world, including as far as Russia and Brazil.
Vamadeva, suppose somebody's listening to this podcast and they're in Poughkeepsie, New York, and they have no background in anything Vedic, and but they're very inspired, and they're a young person, and they want to pursue being a spiritual aspirant, a spiritual practitioner. What would you advise them? Where do they go? What do they read? Where is their starting point?
Well, I always advise to read Autobiography of a Yogi and to see the Awake movie that Phil was involved with on Yogananda. Yogananda I see as the father of the deeper yoga in the West, and living here for so many years and interacting with so many people, he has these more accessible teachings and influences they can start with, but then also to then from that base gradually look into other teachings. Hinduism Today magazine, if you want to understand what Hinduism is, for example. Ayurveda is a good place to start learning Vedic knowledge because it helps you in your daily life with ordinary things, health, both physically and psychological health, and then some basic yoga practices, asana, pranayama, meditation. There's really lots of options to look into now. But to begin to explore, to take a step and to do something every day and to have faith in yourself and your ability to access higher states of consciousness in a meaningful way.
Vamadeva, you spend a lot of time in India, and your wife is Indian. You've even met with Prime Minister Modi. There's a lot of press these days, or a lot of inferences in the media the last couple of years especially, with terms like Hindu extremists or right-wing Hinduism and the term Hindutva. What is your assessment of what's going on in India, and how real is this issue, and what misunderstandings might there be for people in the West who are interested in what's going on in India?
Yes, this is a very big question. First of all, I find that almost nobody in America has a decent understanding of social political issues in modern India. They often know little more than Gandhi and Nehru. It's a very complex country with a number of states, a number of political parties, and a number of movements. This effort to remove the traditional teachings and to replace them with, we say, more modern, Western, unspiritual influences is not unique to India, but it's been going on there for several decades. And we can also compare it to what is happening in Tibet. In Tibet, the traditional culture is marginalized, but the Chinese have pretty much pushed the Tibetans out of the media pictures. One of our friends is the Lobsang Sangye, who is the Sikyang, or leader of Tibet, in exile, and he's telling us now that he can't even get a visa to Europe anymore. So too, a lot of Hindu groups have been demonized by Marxist and communist influences who have been very, very strong in the academia and media of India. At the same time, there are groups that could be regarded as more extremist, even among Hindu groups, but they're relatively small, particularly relative to the other religions of the world. For example, Saudi-funded madrasas, who are called breeding grounds for jihad, are found throughout Asia. Christian schools that promote conversions are found throughout India. Hinduism, there is not a single program of Hindu studies in any university in India, including Banaras Hindu University. So Hindu influences are actually quite a bit marginalized or put into the background. They've often been politically in the background. And in recent years, as the Indians overseas and the Indians in India have gotten more regard for their heritage, there's been a social revival of, you might say, Hindu influences, and the Western-based and Marxist-based influences are now feeling a bit frightened by that. So there is a certain, you might say, social upheaval in India going on, nothing like what is going on in the Middle East, but this idea of our tradition has value, how do we preserve it on one hand, and other groups saying your tradition has no value and it should be eliminated. And you do have conservative things in the tradition, like certain caste things that obviously need to be reformed. You have very positive things in the tradition. In fact, yoga is only taking off in India today, because previously it was regarded as something backward and Hindu. So too with a lot of things like Ayurveda. When I saw Ayurveda initially, it had no funding and no respect. Now it's gaining that because it has respect in the West. So a lot of these traditional disciplines are looked at very negatively in India, or have been, that are looked on positively in the West. But now that is slowly changing, and we see a certain churning and upheaval, and it's important to understand both sides and to understand there is a Hindu point of view, there is a traditional point of view, a yogic point of view. Great gurus like Vivekananda and Aurobindo and even Yogananda also had their criticisms of Western culture. Mahatma Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said it would be a good idea.
In that context, maybe in the limited time we have, could you address the issue of conversion? Just as a background, there's been a lot of press in the last couple of years of outrage about Hindus trying to convert people, Indian people who are Christian. I know, because of my time in India, the level of disturbance there is about the Christian missionary effort. Could you give us some perspective?
Yes, Christian missionary activity is very strong in India. It's massively funded largely through the United States, and particularly through the Christian right in America, the Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Southern Baptists. They're very active in the south of India, and they demonize the Hindu tradition. The Catholics are also very much involved in conversion, although they're more on the soft side and they give some respect to Hindu teachers and teachings, but say God would like you better if you were a Catholic or a Christian. So the missionary activity is very strong. It's highly funded. The churches own a lot of land. They have a lot of influences in the media as well. So there is a Hindu reconversion movement that's actually been going on for more than 100 years. But the fact is, if conversion is going on, reconversion cannot be criticized. But because reconversion has been highlighted more recently, and because of the Western money, there's been a kind of demonization of the reconversion movement, while not criticizing the much larger Christian conversion movement. The amount of money that's spent in India by Christian and Islamic forces aiming at conversion of Hindus is probably 100-fold more, I'm not exaggerating, at least tenfold, than the other side, and there are major institutions involved in doing that. This is, again, a major cultural issue, but I think we in the West have to recognize there is a Hindu side, and we should look carefully as to who from America is promoting these conversion efforts in India, and we would be surprised to see the Christian right very active there as well.
And Vamadeva, along those lines, my understanding is Hinduism is not a religion of conversion. It's not like Hindu missionaries go to Europe and North America, South America, Africa, looking to make people into Hindus. But more what they're doing in India is responding to what many people see as aggressive activities by Christianity, Islam, other religions.
That's true to some extent. You have to understand that traditionally Hinduism spread as far as Indonesia and the Philippines to the east. The largest Hindu temple in the world is Angkor Wat. Hinduism was spread into Nepal. It was very common in Central Asia, Afghanistan. So it did spread, but it spread through a sharing of teachings rather than through kind of this belief-based conversion. And there was a lot of commonality of Hindu and Buddhist teachings and sharing. There's extensive Hindu temples today, or temples to Hindu deities in Japan, for example. That's been a subject of important studies recently. So these religions have spread, but in a non-aggressive way.
Right.
Right, and we're all the beneficiaries of that non-aggressive spread into the West.
Yes, and even some of our older Western traditions, like the Celtic and some of the Greco-Roman things, have a lot of affinity with older traditions coming out of India.
Right.
Vamadeva, thank you so very much for your time today. And I do feel we just scratched the surface. There are many areas I certainly would like to go into more deeply with you, as I'm sure Phil would as well. Phil, any final points? Any other?
I'd like to give Vamadeva like to give him the opportunity to mention his institute and any forthcoming projects or events and books, etc., that he'd like the listeners to know about.
Well, first I'd like to thank both of you. I don't think I've received an interview with such a variety of deep and complex questions. I hope I've been able to answer them quickly. In terms of books, Shiva, the Lord of Yoga, has come out from Lotus Press last year. Shiva is the main figure that epitomizes or symbolizes the yoga tradition. He's the Lord of Asana, the Lord of Prana, the Lord of Mantra, the Lord of Meditation. So that has come out. I'm also having a new book coming out in a couple of months called The Art and Science of Vedic Counseling, with Dr. Suhas Kshir-Sagar, who we work with at the Chopra Center, and other places, showing how we can integrate Vedic disciplines like yoga, Ayurveda, and Jyotish, and also Vastu in a meaningful counseling practice. Our American Institute of Vedic Studies is mainly online-based, online courses, yoga, Ayurveda, Jyotish, but lots of resources, articles. And then my wife, Yogini Shambhavi, organizes wonderful Yoga Shakti retreats. We have one above Rishikesh coming up in March. We have one in Santa Fe that we'll be doing in August. She'll also be doing another one in Germany in July. So these are ongoing. We're also traveling throughout India, doing regular programs with various ashrams and organizations there. And we do that somewhat with various organizations in the United States. I'll be one of the keynote speakers for the NAMA, the National Ayurvedic Medical Association Conference, that will be I think it's in Rhode Island in April of this year. Dr. Vasant Lat, another great teacher in the Vedic and Ayurvedic field, will also be there. So we have these through our website, through our Facebook, and we also maintain ongoing connections with groups and teachers and organizations in India.
And is your travel schedule on your website, which we should tell listeners is Vedanet, VEDANET.com?
Yes, travel schedule, those things are there, and itinerary, ongoing events. You can access over 100 original articles that I have done on all these various Vedic subjects, all the different books, courses, links to various Vedic resources. We try to connect you to the greater Vedic and Hindu community as a whole, and also to recognize that there is a universal tradition of truth, knowledge, spirituality. We can give it different names, but I think this tradition has been better preserved in Asia, particularly India and Tibet, but it's a global heritage. It's spreading globally, and we should all make it our own and integrate it into our life and environment, but in a legitimate and respectful way for these sacred powers of consciousness.
Vamadeva, thank you so very much. I'm very excited to have you back on the show sometime soon because, as I mentioned before, there are many, many areas we can go into much more deeply with you. You're listening to Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. And again, our guest today, Dr. David Frawley, also known as Vamadeva. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a great privilege and honor, and we appreciate the level of teaching and work that you're doing.
Thank you.